The winds of Xylos Prime carried the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of molten adamantium, a constant symphony of industry that had defined the forge world for millennia. Here, beneath skies perpetually choked by ash and the glow of hyper-furnaces, the Adeptus Mechanicus toiled, not just to forge weapons and starships, but to preserve the vast, intricate tapestry of imperial knowledge. Xylos Prime was a repository world, its planetary data vaults containing the strategic acumen of 1,000 campaigns, the tactical doctrines of Segmentum Command, and the hallowed operational procedures of countless Space Marine chapters, all meticulously catalogued and cross-referenced by unblinking servitors and tireless cog priests. It was a monument to data, a citadel of intellect in a galaxy that often prioritized brute force. It was this very wealth of information that drew the tendrils of Hive Fleet Leviathan. The initial incursions were brutal, conventional in their horror. Gaunts swarmed, warriors tore through armored lines, and Carnifexes battered aside defensive bastions with predictable, if terrifying, efficiency. The planetary defense forces, a mix of Skitarii legions and Imperial Guard regiments rotated in from the nearby agri-worlds, met the onslaught with grim resolve, relying on the vast strategic databanks of Xylos Prime to predict Tyranid movements and counter their evolving tactics. For weeks, the war was a bloody stalemate, a microcosm of the eternal conflict between the Imperium and the ravenous Xenos. Then, the anomalies began. The 34th Cadian Ironhearts, renowned for their disciplined adherence to the standard Imperial war doctrine, found their expertly laid ambushes preempted, their flanking maneuvers met by prepared Tyranid forces, their fallback routes already cut off. It was as if the hive mind had read their battle plans directly from the minds of their officers. General Routh, a veteran of 3 Tyranid wars, dismissed it as sophisticated Tyranid synaptic coordination, an accelerated evolutionary response. He doubled down on his most complex strategies, those known only to his immediate command staff, encrypted and transmitted via secure Vox channels. Yet, the Xenos continued to react with unnerving precision, striking at the psychological weak points of his formations, the freshly conscripted platoons, the regiments depleted by recent battles, the specific sectors where morale was known to be faltering. Meanwhile, within the sprawling data cathedrals of Xylos Prime, the tech priests observed deeper, more disturbing patterns. Auspex readings from newly deployed mnemivore bioforms, a designation given hastily to the new, segmented, multi-limbed creatures that seemed to float above the battlefield, their head clusters pulsating with sickly light, showed an unusual psychic signature. It wasn't the raw, overwhelming synaptic scream of a hive tyrant, nor the subtle influence of a lictor. It was something far more insidious, a resonance that mirrored, then devoured, the complex electromagnetic impulses of the planetary data networks. Magos explorator Valerius Xylos, keeper of the great archives and master of Xylos Prime's strategic algorithms, was the first to grasp the horror. His serfs, meticulously archiving decades of Cadian battle records, reported inexplicable data corruption. Entire campaigns vanished, replaced by nonsensical binary sequences, or worse, by fragments of forgotten, deeply personal memoirs of long-dead commanders. One data slate, meant to contain the logistical manifests of the Ironhearts, instead displayed the chilling, handwritten final thoughts of a Cadian sergeant from a forgotten conflict, his fears and regrets laid bare. Valerius Xylos, his mechadendrites twitching with an unprecedented alarm, cross-referenced the corrupted data with the Mnemovore's psychic signature. The correlation was terrifying. The Xenos were not just destroying data, they were consuming it. And not just the data of machines, but the very essence of human thought. The psychic resonance peaked around moments of intense cognitive activity, moments of strategic planning, moments of decision, moments of fear. It was as if the Mnemovores were feeding on the mind itself, a horror far beyond mere biomass. A critical planetary defense system, a vast network of automated laser batteries known as the Aegis Grid, abruptly malfunctioned in Sector Gamma. The tech priests sent to investigate found the control servitors inert, their cogitator brains fried not by conventional overload, but by an esoteric psychic imprint. As they analyzed the ruins, one servitor, its optics flickering erratically, began to emit distorted audio. It was not static, but a fragmented, almost sentient stream of data, a jumble of battle plans, personal anxieties, and strategic counter-arguments, all distinct voices, all from Imperial officers, some long deceased. The Mnemovore, or whatever terrible thing it was, had not just consumed data, it had understood it, processed it, and regurgitated it in a grotesque mockery of sentient thought. The reality solidified. The Tyranids were not just eating flesh, they were eating minds. They were devouring the very strategies intended to defeat them, consuming the fears that could paralyze a commander, learning the hidden weaknesses of the Imperium from its own history. Xylos Prime, the bastion of knowledge, was becoming the hive mind's new classroom. And the lessons learned by the Xenos would be taught in blood, drawn from the very minds they had plundered. The whispers had begun, not of the warp, but of the consumed echoing back from the void spawn. The grim revelation clawed its way through the stoic resolve of Xylos Prime's defenders, a truth far more terrifying than any physical threat. Magos Valerius Xylos, his synthetic voice a strained rasp through his vocalizers, presented his findings to the planetary command. General Routh of the Imperial Guard and Inquisitor Hector Thorne, a gaunt, watchful agent of the Ordo Xenos, who had arrived weeks prior, drawn by the unusual psychic signatures emanating from the beleaguered Forge world. The hololith projection in the dimly lit command bunker flickered, showing the intricate psychic feedback loops, the inexplicable data corruption, and the disturbing vocal fragments retrieved from the defunct servitors. They do not merely consume biomass, Magos Xylos declared, his metallic fingers gesturing towards the spectral image of a Mnemovore. They consume the neural pathways themselves, the synaptic architecture of sapient minds, the memories, the knowledge, the very patterns of thought that define us. The hive mind is not merely adapting, it is learning from our very minds. General Routh, a man whose face was etched with the scars of 100 battles and the weight of 1,000 fallen comrades, stared at the image with a mixture of disbelief and growing horror. You mean to say, Magos, that these Xenos are reading our minds, predicting our moves because they've plucked the strategies from our brains? More than that, General, Inquisitor Thorne interjected, his voice low and gravelly, his eyes fixed on the pulsating Mnemovore image. If they consume memory, they consume experience. They consume fear. They consume regret. They consume the very weaknesses that define us, that we strive to hide even from ourselves. Imagine a foe that knows your deepest failures, your greatest shames, your most vulnerable loved ones. A foe that weaponizes not just your strategies, but your very psyche. The horrifying truth began to manifest on the battlefields with chilling precision. The Tyranid advance, while once a tidal wave of chitin and claw, now felt like a surgeon's scalpel, exquisitely precise in its brutality. They didn't just attack strongpoints, they attacked the people defending them. A critical defensive line, held by the stalwart 12th Xylosian PDF, crumbled not under the weight of a massed gaunt assault, but due to an insidious campaign of psychological terror. Vox channels, previously secure, began to crackle with distorted voices. Not Tyranid screeches, but the familiar yet subtly twisted voices of fallen commanders, dead comrades, even long-lost family members. "Captain Valerius," whispered a voice eerily similar to his long-dead younger sister. "Why did you leave me to the Reavers on Agri-World Beta 7? You always were a coward." Within hours, Captain Valerius, a man known for his unflappable courage, was found huddled in a bunker, rocking back and forth, muttering incoherent apologies to an unseen presence, his mind shattered. His company, demoralized and confused by the unseen psychological assault, broke and fled, leaving a gaping hole in the planetary defenses. Meanwhile, the 34th Cadian Ironhearts found their morale corroding from within. Snipers, usually unerringly accurate, missed critical shots. Heavy weapon, teams faltered. Squad leaders hesitated. It wasn't cowardice. It was profound, debilitating doubt. Tyranid lictors, their forms shimmering just beyond the periphery of sight, were observed emitting a low psychic pulse, a soundless scream that seemed to resonate directly in the minds of the Cadians. These were not the usual fear-inducing psychic attacks. Instead, the soldiers experienced vivid, terrifying hallucinations, the ghosts of battles lost, their own tactical blunders replayed in excruciating detail, their deepest insecurities amplified to unbearable levels. A veteran sergeant, known for his stoicism, suddenly froze, convinced he saw the face of the general he'd failed to protect on Proxima Prime, superimposed over a charging Hormagaunt. He raised his lasgun, not at the Xenos, but at his own comrade, believing him to be the general, about to pronounce judgment. Fratricide, confusion, and panic spread like a plague, instigated not by physical wounds, but by scars on the soul. The mnemivores themselves were observed more closely now. They weren't frontline combatants, but spectral orchestrators. They moved with an unsettling grace, their multi-jointed limbs unfolding and retracting as they drifted silently over the battlefield. Their primary head cluster pulsed with an oily, bioluminescent glow, like a sickly internal sun, drawing in the psychic echoes of suffering, terror, and the frantic, desperate thoughts of those fighting for their lives. Lesser cerebral nodes on their segmented bodies flickered, like eyes observing, processing, learning. They were the hive mind's new sensory organs, its collective intelligence now enhanced by the direct consumption of enemy consciousness. Magos Xylos, huddled in his data sanctum, worked with a furious intensity that strained even his cybernetic enhancements. He began to compile a counter-strategy, but it was like fighting a shadow. How do you defend against a foe that knows your every thought, your every fear? He attempted to isolate sensitive data, to encrypt command transmissions with protocols so complex they would make an ordinary tech priest weep. Yet, The mnemivore-enhanced Tyranids continued to exploit weaknesses in the Imperial lines that only an intimate knowledge of the human psyche could reveal. A desperate attempt by a contingent of engineers to activate an ancient orbital defense matrix ended in disaster. The engineers, steeped in the machine cult's litanies and sacred codes, found their minds flooded not with Tyranid static, but with forbidden knowledge, fragments of techno-heresy, and the horrifying logic of rogue AIs from the dark age of technology, information they themselves had once unknowingly accessed and stored within the vast data networks of Xylos Prime. The mnemivores had not merely consumed their memories, they had reflected their own hidden temptations, their own intellectual curiosities, their own carefully suppressed doubts about the omnicia back at them, driving them to schismatic madness. The orbital defenses remained dark. Inquisitor Thorn watched the disintegration with cold dread. He had seen countless Xenos threats, from the rampaging orcs to the insidious Genestealer cults. But this was different. This was not a fight for territory or resources. It was a battle for the very mind, for the essence of what it meant to be human. The Tyranids, guided by the mnemivores, were not just waging war, they were waging a psychological campaign of attrition, slowly, deliberately dismantling the resolve, the sanity, and the very identity of the Imperium's defenders. Xylos Prime was becoming a crucible, where the true, horrifying awakening of the mind thief was being witnessed, and its lessons were being etched in the blood-stained, psychologically shattered remnants of Imperial humanity. The horror was no longer just external, it was internal, burrowing deep into the very heart of the defenders. The fall of Xylos Prime was inevitable, a tragic footnote in the grim calculus of the galactic war. But the lessons learned by the hive mind there were revolutionary. The mnemivore strain, refined and proliferated, became the hive mind's new, terrifying sixth sense, allowing it to navigate the labyrinthine complexities of sentient warfare with an unprecedented chilling efficiency. The era of brute force alone was over. Now, the Tyranids fought with the stolen wisdom of their foes. The next great test and triumph of the mnemivore's new capabilities came with the assault on the Valerius naval base, a critical Imperial strongpoint orbiting the industrial world of Xylos. Valerius was no mere docking station. It was a fortress capable of housing entire battle fleets, its defensive armaments a dense web of void shields, plasma conduits, and macro cannon arrays. Its command staff consisted of some of the most experienced strategists in the Segmentum Pacificus, their careers spanning decades of void warfare against a myriad of Xenos and heretical threats. Their knowledge, painstakingly acquired and rigorously applied, was the primary obstacle to the Hive fleet's advance into the Xylos subsector. The Tyranid fleet approached Valerius with a seemingly conventional deployment, a massive vanguard of bioships, thick with spores and crushing waves of smaller attack craft. The Imperial Navy commanders, Vice Admiral Theron and Commodore Jelena, immediately initiated their well-practiced defensive protocols, deploying fighter wings, establishing interlocking firing lanes, and prepping their capital ships for a protracted engagement. These strategies were deeply ingrained, part of the core teachings of the Valerius Command Academy, honed over generations. But the mnemivore-enhanced Hive fleet did not engage in a head-on clash as expected. Instead, a peculiar lull descended, broken only by the incessant Tyranid psychic static. Weeks passed with only probing attacks that seemed designed to gather intelligence, to draw out specific responses. Imperial commanders, frustrated but vigilant, began to feel an insidious mental pressure. Vox channels, though externally secure, began to carry phantom echoes, half-heard whispers of past failures, rivalries, and deeply buried resentments. Vice Admiral Theron, a man whose stern demeanor masked a decades-old rivalry with the late Admiral Kalen, a charismatic figure who had always outshone him, found himself increasingly distracted. He began to second-guess his orders, to see Kalen's ghost in every tactical map, subtly suggesting his own, now flawed, past strategies. Meanwhile, Commodore Jelena, a meticulous planner, became haunted by the memory of a minor logistical oversight from her cadet days that had led to a non-critical supply delay. The mnemivore, through its synaptic tendrils, amplified this long-forgotten insecurity, making her question her judgment, her ability to lead. The psychological warfare intensified. Simulated attacks on specific sections of the base were broadcast via stolen Vox frequencies, using the precise voices and cadences of officers known to be serving in those very sections, crying for help, pleading for relief, only for Imperial patrols to find nothing but empty corridors. These were not random acts. They targeted specific individuals, exploiting known loyalties and bonds. A young lieutenant, whose brother served in the torpedo bays, received a horrifyingly authentic plea for aid from a Voxcaster, purportedly from his sibling, detailing horrific Tyranid borders. He broke protocol, launching a rescue attempt that diverted critical personnel and exposed a flank. The hive mind, having absorbed the vast strategic archives and the individual psyches of thousands of Imperial Navy personnel, began to orchestrate its moves with impossible foresight. It knew which officer, steeped in the traditions of the Valerius Command Academy, would instinctively fall back to the Theta 7 defensive formation when pressured. It knew which rivalries between captains could be inflamed to cause insubordination or delayed responses. It knew which junior officers, eager to prove themselves, would overcommit their forces. The climax came not with a grand fleet engagement, but with a series of perfectly timed, seemingly minor crises. The primary void shield generator in Sector Rho, protected by a specific, complex password known only to the sector's senior tech priest, suddenly shut down. Tyranid boarding torpedoes, packed with hormagaunts, slammed into the unprotected hull with uncanny precision, exploiting structural weaknesses that were only ever recorded in the deepest, most secure design blueprints. The internal defenses, designed to compartmentalize and repel boarders, were systematically bypassed. It was not just that the Tyranids knew the schematics, they knew the minds of the engineers who designed them, the quirks of their protocols, the subtle shortcuts they might have taken. They knew that Chief Engineer Karras, for instance, in a fit of frustration over bureaucracy, had secretly created a backdoor access route to critical environmental controls, a secret known only to him. The Tyranids exploited it, venting atmosphere from critical strong points, crippling defenders without a single shot fired. Vice Admiral Theron, his mind a maelstrom of doubt and phantom grudges, issued a contradictory order, then rescinded it, then issued another, all while arguing with the specter of Admiral Kalen in his mind. The chain of command fractured under the weight of internalized strife. Commodore Jelena, paralyzed by her amplified insecurity, froze at a critical juncture, unable to commit her battle group to a decisive counterattack. Valerius Naval Base, a bastion that had stood for centuries, fell within 3 days. Not by overwhelming force, but by the insidious precision of the mnemivore. its vast libraries of strategy, its meticulously maintained battle records, its proud traditions, and the very personal histories of its dedicated defenders, all were consumed, processed, and weaponized. The hive mind had not merely adapted, it had evolved. It had gained a new, terrible sense, one that perceived the galaxy not just in terms of biomass, but in terms of thought, memory, and the intricate, exploitable weaknesses of the sentient mind. The loss of Valerius was a chilling testament to this rise to prominence, a stark warning that the war for the Imperium's body had now become a war for its very soul. The news of Valerius naval base's collapse sent shockwaves through the Segmentum Pacificus, reverberating far beyond the immediate strategic implications. Imperial command struggled to comprehend the speed and insidious nature of its fall. How could such a formidable fortress, manned by elite personnel, have been so swiftly and comprehensively overrun? The official reports spoke of Tyranid ingenuity and unforeseen biological adaptations, but the whispers amongst the remaining commanders were far darker. There was a sense of something deeply unsettling, an unseen enemy that burrowed into the very foundations of trust. This dark apprehension was soon validated with the collapse of the Veritas Accord, a crucial strategic alliance forged in the fires of the Maelstrom War, now deployed to stem the tide of the Mnemivore-enhanced Hive Fleet tendrils. The Accord comprised elements of 3 prestigious Imperial Guard regiments, the disciplined Cadian 113th, the pragmatic Talarn 27th Desert Ghosts, and the fiercely independent Katakan 9th Jungle Fighters, supported by a newly founded zealous Space Marine chapter, the Knights of Sanctity. Their mission, to hold the vital mining world of Viridia Prime, whose rare mineral deposits were crucial for plasma weaponry production. The Veritas Accord represented a delicate balance of strengths and an uneasy truce between differing command philosophies. Colonel Jarin, a grizzled Cadian veteran, commanded the main planetary defense. Major Layla Sharif, a shrewd Talarn tactician, led deep reconnaissance and guerrilla operations. Captain Mad Dog Ripper, the Catacon's most feared officer, specialized in brutal close-quarters engagements. Overseeing them all was Chapter Master Vorlog of the Knights of Sanctity, a stoic warrior whose fledgling chapter was eager to prove its worth. Their combined strategic doctrines and personal histories were a rich tapestry of experience, fiercely guarded and deeply personal. The Tyranids, however, had already learned their lessons from Xylos Prime and Valerius. The Mnemivores, now deployed in greater numbers and with enhanced psychic range, began their insidious work even before the main Tyranid assault. The initial attacks on Viridia Prime were feints, designed to provoke reactions, to illuminate the command structure, and to subtly draw out the internal fault lines of the Accord. The Mnemivores began to project psychic echoes, not of direct Tyranid threats, but of amplified internal thoughts and memories. Chapter Master Vorlog, a man burdened by the recent loss of his chapter's most revered relic during a contested campaign against Chaos forces, began to receive telepathic insinuations, whispers that accused him of incompetence, of spiritual weakness, of being unworthy to lead his new chapter. These were not direct accusations, but echoes of his own deepest self-doubt, magnified and twisted. He grew withdrawn, his usual decisive commands replaced by hesitant deliberation, his keen gaze clouded by introspection. Amongst the Imperial Guard, the psychological warfare was even more devastating. The Cadian 113th and Talarn 27th had a long-standing, though usually suppressed, rivalry over a contested supply allocation from decades prior, an incident that had cost lives on both sides. The Mnemivores, having consumed relevant historical records and the personal memories of officers who served then, began to subtly leak false intelligence. Old, encrypted Vox logs, doctored to implicate specific Cadian officers in logistical sabotage, appeared on Talarn data slates. Correspondingly, Cadian commanders received manipulated reports of Tallarn units abandoning flanks or hoarding critical supplies, resurrecting ancient resentments. Colonel Jaron, a man who prided himself on his unwavering adherence to duty, suddenly found himself confronting accusations, subtly inserted into his strategic projections, that he had deliberately withheld support from Major Sharif's reconnaissance teams during a critical flanking maneuver, leading to higher Tallarn casualties. These were echoes of real, albeit minor, disagreements, now weaponized. He began to distrust Major Sharif, seeing malice in every tactical suggestion she offered. Major Sharif, meanwhile, was plagued by vivid psychic projections of Colonel Jaron callously disregarding her troops' pleas for heavier fire support, twisting a legitimate tactical decision in a moment of extreme pressure into an act of betrayal. She saw him not as a comrade, but as a callous bureaucrat obsessed with Cadian glory at the expense of others. Communication between the Cadian and Tallarn forces, once fluid, became terse, then openly hostile, hindering crucial joint operations. The Kadashan Ninth, true to their nature, were less susceptible to such nuanced psychological ploys. They reveled in direct combat, their minds honed to primal survival. But the Mnemivores found their own unique angle of attack. Captain Ripper, a man with a brutal yet deeply loyal connection to his troops, found his most savage tactics revealed to the enemy. The Tyranids began to anticipate his traps, to bypass his favored ambush points, and even to mimic the specific, animalistic calls his units used for covert communication. The Mnemivore had consumed his battle-hardened instincts, turning his greatest strengths against him. Moreover, they projected the grotesque, tortured memories of his fallen Catacon brothers, amplifying the survivors' guilt and anger, sowing discord and desperation. The final blow to the Veritas Accord was delivered not by a colossal Tyranid charge, but by internal collapse. Chapter Master Vorlog, his faith shaken and his mind clouded, retreated into an isolated vigil, neglecting to commit his Space Marines to a crucial counterattack, paralyzed by his own internal demons. Colonel Jaron and Major Sharif, locked in a bitter, Mnemivore-fueled dispute over command authority, failed to coordinate their forces, leaving a vast sector of Viridia Prime exposed. Captain Ripper, his tactics compromised and his men demoralized by the horrific mental echoes of their dead, launched a desperate, suicidal charge that achieved nothing but further casualties. The Veritas Accord, once a symbol of unity, shattered. Its components, instead of fighting the Tyranids, turned their suspicions and animosity inward. The Space Marines were withdrawn, their chapter master broken. The Cadian and Tallarn regiments, their cooperation irrevocably poisoned by unearthed grievances, ceased to function as a cohesive unit. The Catachans were decimated, their feral spirit exploited and broken. Viridia Prime fell swiftly thereafter, its valuable mineral resources devoured, its defenders consumed body and mind. The Mnemivore had demonstrated its mastery, not merely adapting to enemy strategies, but destroying the very will to fight, turning foes' own history, their own secrets, their own internal strife, into the most potent weapons of the hive mind. The shadow had fallen, and it was cast by the echoes of their own minds. Amongst the fractured remnants of the Imperium's beleaguered forces, as the news of Valerius and Viridia Prime spread like a plague of despair, a new and relentless enemy of the Mnemivore began to take shape. Inquisitor Kael. A name whispered with reverence and fear, Idihar. In equal measure, Kael had carved out a formidable reputation within the Ordo Xenos. He was not a warrior inquisitor of the zealous sort, nor a shadowy manipulator of the clandestine type. Kael was a scholar, a meticulous analyst, his formidable intellect honed over centuries of cataloging, studying, and ultimately destroying Xenos threats through strategic understanding rather than brute force. He understood alien psychologies, predicted their evolution, and exploited their vulnerabilities with cold, surgical precision. Or so he had believed. Kael's retinue was a carefully curated collection of specialists, master cryptographers, savant xenolinguists, veteran combat psychers, and a coterie of heavily augmented Skitarii bodyguards. Together, they formed a mobile, formidable intelligence gathering and eradication unit. They had arrived at the outer fringes of the Mnemivore's expanding operational zone, drawn by the escalating psychic emanations and the increasingly disturbing patterns of Imperial defeats. Kael, with his vast personal archive of Xenos data and his unparalleled analytical prowess, was confident he could unravel this new Tyranid threat. Their target was a newly designated Tyranid synaptic node on the desolate, ice-bound world of Glacius 6, a world that was strategically insignificant in terms of resources, but crucial as a conduit for Hive Fleet communications. Kael theorized that this node represented a concentration of the Mnemivore strain, a central nervous system for its insidious new abilities. His plan was audacious, a surgical strike, spearheaded by his combat psychers, to disrupt the node, hoping to sever the Mnemivore's collective psychic connection and gain invaluable intelligence in the process. The insertion was flawless. Kael's specialists, Ghost Squad Alpha, a unit of stealth-trained Kasurkan, slipped past the outer Tyranid patrols with uncanny ease, guided by their Inquisitor's preemptive analysis of enemy movements. They reached the glacial cavern that housed the pulsating biomass of the node, a grotesque spectacle of organic machinery. Kael, observing from orbit aboard his modified frigate, the Whisper of Soul, received their real-time telemetry and tactical updates. Everything was proceeding precisely as predicted, a testament to his strategic genius. Then the whispers began. Not from the Kasurkan, but from Kael's own Voxcom. A voice, familiar yet chillingly distorted, began to speak. It was his own, younger self, reciting lines of poetry he had written in his youth, forgotten and deeply embarrassing. Then came the voice of his mentor, Inquisitor Viridian, uttering words of scorn and disappointment, dredging up a critical analytical error Kael had made during his apprenticeship, a mistake that had cost innocent lives, a secret burden he carried deep within his psyche, one he had never shared with anyone. On Glacius 6, the attack on the synaptic node was failing. The combat psychers, prepared for the usual Tyranid psychic assault, found their minds bombarded by their own deepest insecurities, their own forbidden desires, their own traumatic memories. One psyker, a grizzled veteran named Lyra, who had narrowly survived a catastrophic psychic backlash years prior, was suddenly paralyzed by vivid hallucinations of that very event, her own mind turning against her, reliving every scream, every burning touch of warp fire. She collapsed, incapacitated. The Kasrkin, meanwhile, found their highly disciplined tactics dissolving into chaos. Sergeant Rorik, a man with a painful secret past as an enforcer in a brutal agri-world gang, found his most violent, repressed memories manifesting as Tyranid illusions. He saw the faces of the innocents he'd harmed, not as gaunts, but as grotesque mockeries of his past victims, screaming for vengeance. His resolve broke, his training forgotten as he fired wildly at phantoms. Others in his squad suffered similar fates, their bonds of brotherhood dissolving under the weight of individually tailored psychological attacks, using stolen secrets, past betrayals, and personal fears to turn comrade against comrade. Kyle watched, helpless, as his entire retinue disintegrated, not under claw and tooth, but under the weight of their own minds. His savant cryptographer began muttering complex codes of forbidden knowledge. His xenolinguist screamed prophecies in long-dead Xenos tongues, their minds devoured by information overload, twisting their expertise into insanity. The Skitarii, their bionic brains less susceptible to emotional manipulation, were nevertheless overwhelmed by logical paradoxes generated from their own programming, freezing mid-stride as they calculated the inescapable self-contradictions fed into their systems. The synaptic node pulsated brighter, gorged on the richness of Kyle's elite retinue's minds. It wasn't just their knowledge of Imperial tactics it had consumed, but their personal histories, their fears, their hopes, their very identities. Kyle himself, still aboard the Whisper of Soul, was not spared. The whispers intensified, now speaking of his failures, his cold calculations that sometimes led to necessary sacrifices, his suppressed yearning for understanding over mere annihilation. It laid bare his intellectual pride, his belief in his own superiority, and the deep, abiding loneliness that came with it. He witnessed the last moments of Ghost Squad Alpha through his Vox feed, their desperate, confused cries as their minds shattered, their final thoughts not of heroic defiance, but of personal shame and terror, all absorbed by the glowing Mnemivore node. The horror was complete. Kyle, the master of understanding, the unparalleled analyst, had been utterly outmaneuvered. He had led his most trusted operatives, his closest companions, to their psychological slaughter, not knowing that the enemy already possessed the keys to their minds, gleaned perhaps from data trails, from brief psychic brushes, from the vast, interconnected network of Imperial information. Inquisitor Kyle, known for his unshakable logic and emotionless demeanor, felt a tremor of pure, unadulterated terror, and a rage as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. He had lost his entire retinue, his carefully constructed intellectual fortress utterly breached. All his meticulously guarded secrets, his decades of compiled Xenos lore, his tactical genius, his personal vulnerabilities, all of it now lay within the collective consciousness of the hive mind. The Mnemivore was his personal demon, born from his own knowledge. He was no longer a dispassionate observer. He was a victim, a vessel of stolen memories, and a new, singular purpose ignited within him: to hunt this arch-nemesis, to understand it and to destroy it, or be utterly consumed in the attempt. He was no longer fighting for the Imperium alone. He was fighting to reclaim his own stolen mind,